It began quietly, as most perfect crimes do. Not with an explosion or a shattered lock, but with paperwork, dull, precise, and unremarkable. The Meridian City Museum of Art had stood for nearly 80 years, a grand, columned landmark in the heart of downtown. It was the kind of building the city used on postcards, all pale stone and polished steps, banners fluttering with the latest exhibit. For decades, it had guarded one of the most valuable private collections in the country. Paintings by the masters. Sculptures insured for tens of millions. But tucked deep in its climate-controlled vaults were pieces that didn't even have prices, works that had never been shown publicly. They called it the Meridian Collection. And in 2017, that collection quietly vanished. It wasn't just a theft. It was an erasure, $1 billion worth of art removed without violence, without alarms, and without anyone noticing until it was too late. No one knew who took it. No one even knew when it was taken. And to this day, the case remains unsolved. The story of how it happened begins with a man known only by one name, the architect. He was never officially identified, but his influence could be traced like fingerprints across the entire operation. Investigators believe he was in his late 40s at the time. Educated, methodical, and unassuming. Those who dealt with him later described a person who made complexity feel simple, the kind of mind that saw structure in chaos. He didn't recruit criminals. He recruited specialists. The first was a woman known in restoration circles as the restorer. A perfectionist with an artist's precision. She could duplicate a 16th-century brushstroke so perfectly that even a museum scanner couldn't distinguish it from the original. Her career had plateaued after a scandal. A piece she authenticated later proved to be fake, though many believed she had been set up. The architect found her working quietly in a private studio overseas, replicating museum-quality works for legal reproductions. He didn't offer money at first. Just an opportunity, the chance to correct history, to pull off something no one else could. The second recruit was the archivist, a systems engineer who had once worked for a cultural preservation agency. She was the one who understood data. Databases, access lists, cataloging software, all the invisible layers that kept a museum running. To her, the digital map of the Meridian Museum was more revealing than any blueprint. She could see which artworks were moved, when humidity levels changed, which curators logged in after hours. The third was Jonah. Jonah wasn't a criminal. He wasn't even particularly daring. He was a quiet museum security technician, the kind of employee who faded into the background. He kept his uniform pressed, showed up early, and never spoke unless spoken to. What made him valuable wasn't skill. It was access. He had the kind of clearance that came from years of quiet reliability. Every night, while the museum's lights dimmed and its visitors disappeared into the night, Jonah walked the corridors with a small flashlight and a clipboard, logging temperatures, checking locks, and glancing at camera feeds that never seemed to show anything interesting. The architect never approached him directly. Instead, he was introduced through a series of intermediaries, contractors who handled the museum's equipment, consultants who came and went. Each conversation was innocent enough. Questions about how the system worked, what upgrades were planned, how long backups were stored. It wasn't until months later that Jonah realized he'd been drawn into something much larger. By then, it was too late. The plan had already begun. Unlike most heists, the Meridian Job didn't rely on force. It relied on trust, the most fragile currency in any institution. The architect's brilliance wasn't in breaking systems. It was in understanding them. He studied how museums functioned, not their security weaknesses, but their human patterns. Who signed off on which shipments? Who handled restoration? Which firms handled insurance audits? And, more importantly, how often people assumed someone else had already checked something. He once wrote, in a note later found by investigators, "The safest place to hide is inside routine." And that became the foundation of the plan. The Meridian Museum regularly moved artworks for cleaning, study, or loans. Each piece required paperwork, a set of forms that passed through multiple departments, often signed digitally by people who never saw the actual artwork. The archivist created a ghost pipeline within that process. Real inventory numbers. Real approvals. But the destinations were slightly off, an address changed by one digit, a courier name replaced with another already approved elsewhere. Every form looked legitimate. Every name checked out. And every movement was logged correctly in the museum system. Except, of course, the artworks never came back. The restorer's role was equally intricate. She didn't just copy the paintings, she aged them. Tiny cracks in varnish. Traces of oxidation. Microscopic dust signatures consistent with the museum's environment. When the originals were quietly replaced, even high-resolution scans didn't flag discrepancies. Because, technically, there weren't any, the system still recognized the same metadata tags, the same weights, even the same serial microchips the museum had begun embedding years earlier. Those chips were genuine. Because the crew had removed them from the originals first. The level of patience required bordered on obsession. The heist didn't happen overnight. It unfolded over nearly 18 months. At first, small works disappeared, a few sketches, a bronze piece. The replacements were flawless. Then came the larger transfers, a Monet, a Vermeer, a pair of Renaissance portraits that hadn't left the vault in decades. Each time, the documentation was impeccable. The trucks arrived on schedule. The guards signed the same forms they'd seen dozens of times before. Even Jonah didn't realize anything was wrong. He thought he was assisting with conservation transfers, logging shipments, checking seals. He noticed the paperwork looked new, cleaner than usual, but didn't question it. He wasn't part of the deception, not consciously. He was the kind of person institutions depend on, the man who assumes everything above him is already verified. And that assumption was exactly what the architect needed. Investigators would later marvel at how completely the operation blended into normal activity. There were no broken locks, no tripped alarms, no missing tapes. Everything in the system said the art was exactly where it should be. By the time anyone suspected otherwise, the originals had already vanished halfway across the world. The first hint of trouble came from an insurance audit. A minor discrepancy, a frame listed as mahogany instead of oak. The archivist had changed the description deliberately, a test to see how quickly anyone noticed. No one did. The report was corrected and refiled without comment. After that, the architect knew the window was closing. Large-scale thefts rely on timing, not just of movement, but of attention. The museum was preparing for a new exhibition, one that required renovations, press tours, and long nights of shifting storage. Amid that chaos, the last and most valuable phase of the plan would unfold. It centered on the Meridian triptych, a set of three 15th-century panels considered the museum's crown jewel. They were said to be worth more than $500 million combined. The transfer paperwork showed they were being sent to a restoration lab in Chicago. The shipping manifests matched. The insurance coverage was updated. Every employee involved had a legitimate reason to believe the movement was authorized. The shipment left on a Tuesday morning. But it never reached Chicago. No alarms were triggered. No distress calls. Just one truck that never arrived, and a second, nearly identical vehicle that was later found to have been purchased months earlier through a shell company. Security footage from the loading dock showed Jonah signing off the forms. He handed the clipboard to a driver he'd seen dozens of times before, one of the museum's regular contractors. The driver smiled, thanked him, and drove away. Except the man wasn't who he thought he was. The real contractor was on vacation. His credentials had been cloned. His routes, copied. Even his voice matched the recordings used in routine security confirmations. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that the museum's chief curator noticed something wrong. The lab in Chicago called to confirm the shipment date for the triptych, but according to their records, they hadn't received anything from Meridian in months. The museum initiated an internal review. At first, everyone assumed it was a clerical error. Then a cross-check revealed that not just the triptych, but dozens of other works, nearly 200 pieces in total, couldn't be located. The panic was immediate and absolute. But by then, the vaults were filled with flawless forgeries, the trucks had been dismantled, and the trail was already cold. The investigation that followed became one of the most complex art theft cases in modern history. The FBI's art crime team was brought in. Interpol issued bulletins. Private insurers hired independent analysts. For months, every lead ended in silence. They discovered the false paperwork trails, the shell companies, the reprinted seals, all executed with such precision that even forensic specialists struggled to separate genuine documents from counterfeit ones. The fake signatures were layered with minute variations that suggested they had been built using real scan samples. The entire operation had been built on one idea, that no one looks closely at what they believe to be routine. Over time, fragments of the truth emerged. Surveillance records suggested that the same unmarked van had appeared near the museum at irregular intervals for nearly a year. Phone logs traced to disposable numbers used briefly, then discarded. A few small artworks surfaced quietly in private collections overseas, but each was recovered without clear proof of how it had left Meridian. The restorer vanished first. Her studio emptied overnight, her accounts closed. The archivist's apartment was found neatly packed, no sign of struggle, just absence. Jonah stayed, confused and terrified, until investigators finally interviewed him. They found him sitting at his kitchen table, staring at the news coverage. He kept insisting he didn't know anything, that he'd just been doing his job. And, in a way, he had. No charges were ever filed against him. The architect was never identified. Years later, a retired investigator described the Meridian Job as the most perfect failure of oversight in modern museum history. Because it wasn't just about what was stolen, it was about how easily truth can be rewritten when systems trust themselves too much. The public never saw the full list of missing works. The museum quietly settled with insurers. They closed their vaults for renovation, and for nearly a year, the Meridian stood silent, its once proud reputation now shadowed by whispers. Even today, if you walk past the building, you can feel that silence. The banners are new, the steps clean, but behind the walls, there's an absence that lingers. Some say the stolen art was dismantled, hidden piece by piece across private estates. Others believe it was sold through intermediaries to collectors who wanted not ownership, but secrecy, the thrill of possessing what no one else could have. But there's another theory. That the architect never sold anything at all. That the real purpose wasn't money, but proof, to show that with enough patience and precision, even the most protected institutions can be rewritten from within. One investigator, long after retirement, said something that still circulates among art crime forums: you can secure a vault. You can encrypt a database. But you can't lock human routine. That's how the Meridian Job happened, not through violence or chaos, but through understanding. Understanding that people trust patterns. That signatures, seals, and routines are just habits made official. And if you can mimic the rhythm of legitimacy long enough, you can make the impossible seem ordinary. The Meridian Job was never solved. The stolen works were never recovered. The suspects never found. But in the years since, every major museum in the world quietly changed its protocols. They started double verifying transfers, auditing paperwork, and cross-checking human assumptions with software. They learned that sometimes the most dangerous thief isn't the one who breaks in, it's the one who learns how the door already opens. And somewhere, perhaps in a private room or a forgotten vault, those paintings might still hang. Hidden. Preserved. Not stolen in rage or greed, but taken as a kind of statement that in the end, the world's greatest theft didn't require breaking in at all. It just required everyone else looking away.